The Drathan Empire had conquered 60 worlds. Not one had refused them twice. High Envoy Kale had done this before, walked into rooms, placed documents on tables, and watched civilizations make the only reasonable choice available to them. Some cried. Some argued for an hour before signing. One species had tried to negotiate, which Kale found almost touching. But they all signed eventually. Everyone did. He arrived on Earth in a shuttle designed to be visible. That was intentional. The Empire liked to be seen arriving. It set the right tone before a single word was spoken. The shadow of the ship passing over a city said more than any speech could. By the time the envoy sat down, the people across the table had already spent hours watching that shadow move and thinking about what it meant. The meeting room the humans provided was plain to the point of being insulting. No grand hall, no ceremonial space. Just a rectangular room with white walls, a long table, and chairs that looked like they came from an office building. Kale had expected this to bother him. Somehow it didn't. There was something about the plainness of it that felt deliberate, like the room itself was a message. Director Alan Cole was already seated when Kale entered. No aide announced him. No one stood. Cole was a thin man somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of face that gave nothing away, not hostile, not afraid, just present. He wore a plain gray suit. No medals, no insignia, nothing to indicate rank or importance. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, still. Kale sat down across from him and placed the document between them. It was a formal ultimatum, translated into 17 human languages, bound in the deep red that the Empire used for all official correspondence. It had been designed carefully. The weight of it, the color, the size, all of it was meant to communicate something before it was even opened. Cole picked it up and read it. Not skimmed read. He turned each page at roughly the same speed, which meant he was actually going through it. He reached the last page, turned it over, and placed the whole thing face down on the table. Then he looked at Kale directly for the first time. "We'll need 12 days, he said. Kale had prepared for several responses. Silence. Visible distress. A request to contact their leadership. Questions about terms. He had not prepared for this. To surrender? Kale asked. To respond. Cole stood, buttoned the middle button of his jacket with one hand, and picked up a glass of water from the side table. We'll be in touch. He left the room. Not quickly, not slowly. He just left, the way a person leaves a meeting they called themselves, and Kale sat there for a moment in the plain white room with the face-down document and genuinely did not know what had just happened. He filed his report as a routine acceptance of terms pending formality. His superiors were satisfied. 12 days was nothing. The fleet was already in position. They would wait. Kale's intelligence team had standing orders to monitor Earth during any negotiation window, looking for military movement, communication spikes, resource stockpiling, anything that suggested a species was considering resistance rather than compliance. They found nothing unusual. Earth's military channels were quiet. There was no mobilization, no emergency broadcast, no visible preparation of any kind. There was, however, one thing that kept appearing in the background of 3 separate surveillance reports, mentioned almost as a footnote each time because it didn't fit any category of concern. A facility was releasing people. The facility itself was the strange part. It existed on no public record Kale's team could find, no government registry, no location listed in any official document. It was identified only because a surveillance satellite picked up a pattern of vehicle movement in and out of a site in a remote area, and a junior analyst had flagged it out of habit. 43 people had left that facility over the course of 11 days, transferred in small groups to different locations, arriving in different cities with no pattern to the destinations. Their files were sealed under a classification that Kale's team did not have clearance to access. Their names, when cross-referenced, were ordinary, the kind of names that appeared nowhere significant, attached to no public record of military service, no academic distinction, nothing. They were, on paper, unremarkable. Kale requested a psychological profile workup as a precaution. Standard procedure. The Empire's profiling system had been developed across centuries of contact with hundreds of species, and it was considered one of the most reliable tools in the diplomatic corps. It categorized individuals by threat potential, behavioral pattern, decision-making type. It took, on average, about 4 minutes per subject. It completed profiles on 11 of the 43. Then it stopped. Not an error, not a system flag. It simply returned no output on the remaining 32. The analyst ran it again. Same result. She switched to manual assessment, reading the raw behavioral data herself, and sent Kale a message at 2 in the morning that said only, "I don't have a category for these people." Cale read the 11 completed profiles twice. Then he sat quietly at his desk for a while. One subject had spent 9 years working inside a hostile government, not as a spy in the conventional sense but as an administrator. He had moved paper, approved documents, redirected resources. By the time anyone understood what he had done, 3 departments had been quietly hollowed out and 2 senior officials had unknowingly signed orders that would later be used against them in court. He had never fired a weapon. He had never been charged with anything. Another had no listed occupation. Her file contained a single line from a decommissioned internal report. Negotiation outcomes correlate with proximity. Keep away from principals. A third subject's file was mostly redacted. What remained was a note from someone with a very senior clearance, written in plain language and underlined, "Do not place near infrastructure of any kind." Cale forwarded the profiles to the War Council with a brief note recommending they delay the timeline. The council replied the same afternoon. "They're sending criminals." Noted. "Proceed as planned." Cale read that reply. Then he looked at the 11 profiles again. Then he looked at the 32 blanks. He thought about the plain white room. The face-down document. The man in the gray suit who had left without asking a single question. He sent one more message to his analyst, "Find out where the other 32 went." She replied 3 days later. "I can't." The vessel launched on the 9th day. Cale had been monitoring Earth's orbital activity since the meeting with Cole, and when the launch alert came through he was already at his desk. He pulled up the feed immediately, expecting to see something, a military configuration, maybe some last-minute show of resistance before the inevitable. What the sensors returned was a single mid-range transport ship, civilian class, moving at standard speed on a direct heading toward the fleet's staging position. No escort. No weapons signature. No second vessel. One ship. 41 people. Cale stared at the number for a moment. The Empire's staging fleet comprised over 200 vessels. Earth had launched one transport with 41 passengers in response to an ultimatum from a civilization that had conquered 60 worlds. He genuinely could not tell if this was surrender or something else entirely. The passenger manifest came through standard channels, filed correctly, no irregularities. Names, ages, listed occupations. Everything in order. Cale forwarded it to his intelligence team with a routine profiling request and went back to monitoring the approach. His lead analyst, a methodical officer named Dreth who had run profiles on hundreds of alien species over a long career, called him 40 minutes later. This was unusual. Standard profiling took 4 minutes per subject and the results came back in a written report. A direct call meant something had happened. "The system stopped on the 3rd subject," Dreth said. Cale set down what he was holding. "Stopped how?" "It returned an incomplete output and flagged an internal error. We restarted it, ran the first 2 subjects again to confirm it was working, then fed in the 3rd. Same result." Dreth paused. "We've run this system on over 200 species. It has never done this before. Run the others manually." "We are. That's why I'm calling." Another pause, longer this time. "The first 2 completed profiles are not normal threat assessments. The system categorizes individuals on scales we've calibrated across centuries of data. Aggression indexes, fear response patterns, loyalty structures, decision-making under pressure. These 2 subjects score in ways that don't map to any existing category. One of them scores so low on fear response that the system initially flagged it as a calibration error. We confirmed it wasn't." Cale looked out at the feed showing the human transport moving steadily toward the fleet. "Send me what you have." The files came through over the next several hours as the manual assessments were completed. Cale read them in the order they arrived. The first subject was a man who had spent 11 years working inside a government that had, at the time, been considered an enemy of Earth's interests. He had not gone in as a soldier or an intelligence operative in any conventional sense. He had gone in as a low-level administrator and had spent over a decade doing paperwork, filing documents, approving requests, redirecting budget allocations. On the surface, 11 years of bureaucracy. What actually happened over those 11 years was that 3 of the government's most critical departments had been quietly restructured from the inside out, 2 senior officials had unknowingly signed documents that would later be used to legally dismantle their own authority, and the entire intelligence apparatus of that government had been rerouted through a filing system that this man controlled from a desk in a mid-level office. He had never been charged with anything. When he eventually left, the government he had spent 11 years inside took another 4 years to understand what had happened to it. The second subject had worked in what Earth listed as crisis negotiation. Cale read her file twice because the first time through he thought he had misunderstood it. She had a recorded resolution rate across 31 high-risk hostage situations spanning 2 decades. 31 resolved, no fatalities among the people she was sent to protect. The methodology notes in her file were where it got strange. In 9 of those 31 situations, the resolution had come not through conventional negotiation, not through appeals to reason or offers of exchange, but through something the file described with clear discomfort as psychological reorientation of the subject. In plain terms, she had talked people out of what they were doing by making them genuinely believe something specific and targeted about what would happen to them if they didn't stop. Not threats. Not promises. Something more precise than either. One internal review note said simply, "She doesn't negotiate outcomes, she negotiates reality." The review board had apparently argued for 3 sessions about what that meant before filing it and moving on. The third file was short. Most of it was redacted. What remained was a career summary that listed no specific operations, no dates, no locations. Just a series of outcome notes from what appeared to be a senior oversight board. The notes were clinical in language but grew progressively more careful in tone as they went on, the way writing does when the person producing it is trying very hard to be precise. The last note at the bottom of the page was not clinical. It was handwritten, added separately from the rest and underlined twice. It said, "Do not place near infrastructure of any kind." No explanation. No context. Just that line underlined twice and then nothing. Cale sat back and thought about that for a while. The remaining 38 profiles arrived incomplete. Dretha's team had managed partial assessments on about half of them, enough to confirm that the pattern held. These were not soldiers, not in any format the Empire systems recognized. They were something the profiling architecture had never been built to measure, which meant they were something the Empire had never encountered before. Cale wrote a careful summary and forwarded everything to the War Council with a recommendation to delay boarding authorization until the profiles were better understood. The Council's response came back within the hour. "They're sending criminals. How desperate. Proceed as planned." Cale read it once. Then he looked at the third file again, the short one, mostly redacted, with the handwritten line at the bottom underlined twice. He thought about the man in the gray suit who had folded the ultimatum face down and left without asking a single question. He thought about 12 days and 41 people and 1 civilian transport heading calmly toward 200 warships. He did not think they were desperate. He approved the boarding authorization because he had no grounds to refuse it and no argument the Council would accept. Then he sat at his desk for a long time after, reading the third file again, looking at that last line. "Do not place near infrastructure of any kind." The transport docked 6 hours later. 41 humans walked aboard the flagship in plain dark clothing, carrying nothing, looking like people who had made this trip before. Cale watched them come through the docking bay on the security feed. Not one of them looked up at the ship around them. Not one of them slowed down or looked uncertain or did anything that a person does when they are walking into something they are afraid of. They already knew where they were going. The Empire called it a reception. That was the word they used in the official communication. A reception aboard the flagship, to formally accept Earth's terms of surrender. Cale had arranged it himself. The location was deliberate. Not a neutral station, not a meeting room on some midpoint asteroid. The flagship. The largest vessel in the Drathan fleet, currently sitting in Earth's own orbit, visible from the ground on a clear night. The message was architectural. "You are coming to us on our ship in your own sky." 41 humans arrived in a single shuttle. No weapons as agreed. They dressed plainly, dark clothing, nothing formal, nothing ceremonial. They looked, if anything, like people attending a work meeting they had been to many times before and found only mildly interesting. Cale met them at the docking bay. He had arranged a full honor guard, 12 soldiers in formal armor flanking the corridor from the bay to the reception hall. Another deliberate choice. He wanted the walk itself to mean something, wanted the humans to feel the length of it, the scale of the ship around them, the weight of where they were. The humans walked through the honor guard without breaking pace. One of them, a shorter man near the back of the group, glanced at the ceiling with what looked like professional curiosity, the way an engineer looks at construction they want to understand. That was the only reaction Cale noticed. Director Cole was not among them. That had been noted and filed, but not considered significant. Instead, the group was led by a woman Cale had not seen before. She was not listed on any of the 43 released from the facility. Her name, provided in the pre-arrival documentation, was given simply as Director Reyes. No first name. No background file. She was perhaps 60, compact, with short gray hair and the kind of stillness that some people develop after years of being in rooms where the wrong word ends badly. The reception hall had been set for theater. Long table, Drathan officers along one side, space for the humans on the other. A formal record would be kept. Kale had planned a short ceremony, the signing of the acceptance document, a brief statement from him, a brief statement from Cole's replacement, and then processing would begin. Reyes sat down, looked at the document in front of her, and set it aside without reading it. Before we get to that, she said, we have some questions. Kale looked at her. This is a surrender reception. Yes, she agreed pleasantly. We'll get there. We just want to understand a few things first. She looked down the table at the Drathan officers. For context. What followed was 6 hours that Kale would spend a long time thinking about afterward. The questions were not what he expected. They did not ask about terms, about the conditions of occupation, about what rights Earth's population would retain. Those would have been understandable questions. Anxious questions, the kind a defeated species asks when they're trying to find the edges of what just happened to them. These were different. They asked about the Empire's food supply. Specifically, which colony worlds handled primary grain production, and whether those worlds operated independently or through a central distribution network. One of the humans had a small notepad and wrote down the answers in longhand. No one stopped him because it seemed like the kind of note-taking a bureaucrat does, and the question seemed administrative. They asked about grief. How the Drathan grieved, specifically, whether it was public or private, how long mourning periods typically lasted, whether the loss of a commanding officer affected unit cohesion in a measurable way. The Drathan officer who answered had done so almost automatically, the way you answer a question that doesn't sound like a threat. They asked about the War Council's residences. Not aggressively, conversationally, the way someone asks about real estate. Do the senior members prefer the capital, or do they tend to keep their families on secondary worlds? Is there a traditional home region that most of the military leadership comes from? One of the Drathan officers had laughed at this one, a short confused laugh, and said most of the senior council kept homes in the Veth district of the capital. The human who asked nodded and said that made sense, that it was good to know families were together. Kale sat in the observation room above the hall and watched the whole thing through the glass. He had positioned himself there for the first hour simply to monitor, intending to return to the floor when the signing began. He stayed for all 6 hours. He could not explain what made him uneasy. The humans were polite. They were calm. Not one of them raised their voice or made any statement that could be interpreted as threatening. They asked questions, they listened to the answers, they thanked the officers for clarifying. Standard meeting behavior, technically. But the questions fit together. That was the thing he kept coming back to. Individually, each one sounded like idle curiosity or background research. Taken together, over 6 hours they formed a shape. Kale was not sure yet what shape, but he felt it the way you feel the outline of something in the dark before you can see it clearly. At the end of the 6th hour, Reyes thanked the officers on their side of the table by name, each one correctly pronounced in order, and asked if she could have a brief private word with Kale before the signing. They stood together near the far wall of the reception hall, out of earshot. We appreciate your patience today, she said. The document still needs to be signed, Kale said. Yes. She glanced back toward her people, who were talking quietly among themselves, relaxed. We're not here to surrender, Envoy. I want to be honest with you about that. We're here because we needed to understand you. The supply lines, the council locations, the grief cycles, we needed to know those things. She looked back at him. We do now. Kale said nothing. You have a family, she said. It was not a question. On the capital. Veth district you mentioned. She hadn't mentioned it. One of his officers had. You should call them tonight. She paused. While the lines are still working the way you expect them to. She smiled. It was a perfectly ordinary smile, polite, brief, the kind you give at the end of a long meeting. It did not reach her eyes at all. The humans left the flagship the same way they arrived. Quietly, in their one transport, heading back toward Earth without signing anything. Kale filed a report describing the meeting as inconclusive and requested guidance from the War Council on next steps. The Council told him to give it a few days. The humans would come around. They always did. 19 days passed. Nothing happened for all 19 of them. No communication from Earth, no second vessel, no public statement. Kale monitored the feeds daily and found nothing unusual. Earth was quiet. The humans were going about their lives. Their broadcasts showed news, entertainment, ordinary civilian activity. Either they had accepted the situation and were processing it privately, or they were waiting for something. Cale could not tell which, and that uncertainty sat in the back of his mind every morning when he reviewed the overnight reports. On the 20th day, a logistics officer on the border fleet submitted a routine discrepancy report. It was the kind of document that got filed dozens of times a week across a fleet this size. A shipment had arrived with incorrect contents, probably a loading error at the origin station would need to be rerouted. Cale's office received a copy as standard procedure and he noted it and moved on. 3 days later, a second discrepancy report came in from a different border fleet. Same issue, different shipment. On the same afternoon, a third report came in from a third fleet. Cale pulled all three and put them side by side. Fleet 1 had received the medical supplies intended for Fleet 2. Fleet 2 had received the fuel components intended for Fleet 3. Fleet 3 had received the equipment order that should have gone to Fleet 1. All three shipments had departed from different origin stations on different days, routed through different relay points, and had all arrived at the wrong destination. The paperwork on each one was completely correct. Every document, every authorization stamp, every routing code, all of it was properly filed and entirely wrong. He sent it to his logistics division and asked them to trace the origin of the error. They came back 4 days later and told him they couldn't find one. The records showed no point at which the routing had been altered. As far as the system was concerned, these shipments had always been going to the wrong place, and every layer of documentation agreed. Cale was still thinking about that when the report came in about Admiral Thresh. Thresh commanded the 4th Border Fleet and had held his clearance level for over 2 decades without incident. His biometric authorization, the one tied to his identity at the deepest level of the Empire's security infrastructure, the one used to access command-level systems and encrypted communications, had been transferred. Not stolen, not copied. Transferred, through proper administrative channels with the correct authorization codes, to a civilian maintenance worker stationed on a supply depot 40 systems away. The maintenance worker had no idea. When security teams contacted her, she was in the middle of a routine equipment check and had not accessed anything beyond her normal work terminals in weeks. No one could explain how the transfer had been initiated or who had authorized it. The system showed a clean record. It had simply happened. Thresh's fleet had been operating for 11 days without him being able to access his own command functions. He had been working around it manually, using secondary systems, assuming it was an administrative error that would be corrected. He had not flagged it as a security issue because it did not look like one. It looked like paperwork. The communication array issue was the one that made Cale's intelligence chief, an experienced officer named Veth, come to his office in person rather than send a report. She sat down across from him and said without preamble, "The capital array has been running a 6-hour delay on all encrypted command traffic for the past 11 days. Cale looked at her. Running it or experiencing it? Running it. Actively. As a feature as far as the system is concerned. Someone set a parameter somewhere and the array has been functioning exactly as designed, except that every encrypted command sent through it has been sitting in a buffer for 6 hours before delivery." She paused. "We only found it because someone noticed that a response to a time-sensitive order had arrived before the order itself, which shouldn't be possible. When we traced it back we found the delay." Another pause longer. 11 days, Cale. Command has been operating on a 6-hour lag for 11 days and nobody noticed because everything kept working. The responses came. The acknowledgements came. Everything came just quietly late. Cale thought about the questions Reyes had asked aboard the flagship. The supply chains. The distribution networks. How the Empire's systems connected to each other. "Find them," he said. "Find out where the humans are and what they've accessed." Veth's team spent the next week on it. What they found was evidence of exactly 2 humans operating inside the Empire systems. Traces, digital footprints, the faint marks of someone moving carefully through infrastructure they understood well. 2 humans, and they had apparently been responsible for none of the specific incidents. Or all of them. The traces didn't point clearly in either direction. 2, Cale said when Veth brought him the findings. "What about the other 39? Veth was quiet for a moment. She was not someone who got visibly unsettled. She had been in intelligence work for 30 years and had developed the professional flatness that the job required. But she was quiet for long enough that Cale noticed it. "We've been trying to locate them since they left the ship," she said carefully. "We've checked every station in range. Every vessel that passed through the area. Every system that showed any unusual access pattern." She stopped. "We think they went home." "Home," Cale repeated. "Back to Earth." "Shortly after leaving the flagship." She looked at him steadily. "We think 39 of them went home and 2 of them stayed." And those two have been inside our infrastructure since before the transport docked. Cale thought about that. He thought about 41 people walking through his honor guard without looking up. He thought about 6 hours of careful questions about supply chains and communication networks and where the War Council's families lived. He thought about the maintenance worker 40 systems away who had Admiral Thresh's biometric clearance and didn't know it. What are the two doing now? He asked. Veth's expression shifted in a way he didn't have a name for. As far as we can tell, she said, nothing. They're just sitting in the system. Waiting. Cale looked out at the orbital feeds. Earth was there, quiet and blue, going about its day. Waiting for what? He asked. Veth didn't answer because she didn't know. Neither did he. But he had read enough of those 41 files to understand one thing clearly now. Whatever came next, the humans had already decided what it was going to be. His side of this had stopped being a decision a long time ago. 8 months after 41 humans walked onto his flagship in plain dark clothing and asked polite questions for 6 hours, Cale stood in front of what was left of the War Council and delivered his report. There were 3 of them now. There had been 9. The other 6 were not dead. That was the thing people kept getting wrong when they heard about it secondhand. They assumed the humans had killed them because that is what you do in a war when you want to break a command structure. You remove the people at the top. Permanently if necessary. It is direct, it is effective, and every species that had ever fought a war understood the logic of it. The humans had not done that. What they had done was considerably harder to explain and, Cale had come to understand, considerably worse from the Empire's perspective. Each of the 6 missing council members had been exposed. Not attacked. Not threatened. Exposed, their records, their decisions, their histories, all of it pulled out and placed in front of Drathan courts in Drathan legal format, argued using Drathan law. The cases were meticulous. Every charge was supported by documentation that had apparently been sitting inside the Empire's own record systems for years, unnoticed or buried. Every piece of evidence was legitimate. Every procedure was correct. The trials had taken 4 months. All 6 had been convicted. Under the Empire's own legal code, the penalties were significant. Not execution, Drathan law reserved that for specific categories of crime, and the humans had been careful, Cale now understood, to build cases around charges that carried a different kind of consequence. Financial ruin. Permanent removal from public office. In 2 cases, the forfeiture of family assets accumulated through what the court found to be corrupt procurement practices spanning decades. The humans had not written the laws that convicted these people. They had simply read them more carefully than anyone else had bothered to. The 3 remaining council members who sat across from Cale now were the 3 who had been, apparently, clean enough that no case could be built against them. Or perhaps they had been left deliberately, kept in place to receive exactly this report, to sit in this room and listen and understand what had happened. Cale was no longer certain there was a difference. He set his report on the table and went through it section by section. Every fleet that had enforced the original ultimatum against Earth had been compromised in some way. Not destroyed. Compromised. Supply lines quietly rerouted, command authorizations redistributed, communication systems running on parameters that someone else had set and that the Empire's own technicians were still 8 months later, not entirely sure how to reverse. The fleets were operational in a technical sense. They could move. They could communicate. But there were layers underneath the operational surface that no longer responded the way they should, and every time a team thought they had found and fixed the problem, something adjacent turned out to have been adjusted as well. It was, one of Cale's senior engineers had told him privately, like trying to restore a room that someone had very carefully and very thoroughly rearranged while you were sleeping. Everything was still there. Nothing was where it should be. The 2 humans Veth's team had tracked inside the Empire systems had departed, as far as anyone could tell, sometime in the 5th month. They had not announced it. The access traces simply stopped appearing. Whether they had left something behind before going, some final adjustment running quietly in the background of systems no one had thought to check, was a question Cale's technical teams were still working on. He suspected they would be working on it for a long time. The 39 who had gone straight home, Cale understood now what they had been doing in the months since. The legal work alone would have required teams of people operating across multiple jurisdictions, translating records, building cases, filing documents through third-party channels so that by the time anyone in the Empire noticed the legal proceedings they were already underway in legitimate Drathan courts with legitimate Drathan judges reviewing legitimate Drathan evidence. You could not stop it without dismantling your own legal system, and the humans had apparently understood that before they started. Cale finished his report and sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the 3 remaining council members asked the question Cale had been expecting since he walked in. What do they want? Cale slid the document across the table. It had arrived through standard diplomatic channels 2 weeks ago, filed correctly, no irregularities. A single page. 3 sentences. The council member read it aloud, slowly because it deserved to be read slowly. We don't want your territory. We don't want your resources. We want you to remember that you asked for this, and that we were the ones who chose to leave you breathing. No signature. No official seal. Just those 3 sentences, and below them, in smaller text, a reference number that Cale's team had traced back to the original ultimatum document, the one Cole had read in that plain white room and placed face down on the table. They had kept the reference number. They wanted the Empire to know this was a response. A direct, considered, deliberate response to what had been started 8 months ago in that room. Cale sat in the silence that followed and thought about things he had not let himself think about clearly until now. He thought about an old warning he had dismissed. There had been precedent for this, species who had tried to understand humans before the Empire had, who had come to the Council and spoken carefully about what happened when you hurt these people. He had read those records. He had not understood them. He understood them now. He thought about 41 people walking through his honor guard and not one of them looking up at the ship around them. Not because they were not paying attention. Because they had already studied the schematics. He thought about Cole in that plain white room, folding the ultimatum face down, saying we'll need 12 days to respond, and leaving without asking a single question. Not because he had nothing to ask. Because he had already decided that the answers would come later, in a different room, from people who did not know they were answering. He thought about Reyes telling him to call his family while the lines still worked the way he expected them to. She had not said the lines would go down. She had said while they worked the way you expect. That was a different thing entirely, and he had only understood the difference later. The weapons, Cale thought. Everyone had spent 8 months looking for the weapons. The ships, the systems, the tools the humans must have used to do what they did. His engineers had pulled apart half the Empire's infrastructure looking for foreign hardware, foreign code, something physical and identifiable that could be removed and pointed to as the source of the problem. They had never found anything. Because there was nothing to find. 41 people had walked onto his ship with no weapons declared. That had been true. The declaration had been accurate. The humans were not carrying weapons. The humans were the weapons. Each one of them, individually, a different kind, a different skill, a different capability, a different way of taking something apart quietly and completely without ever raising a hand. And Earth had not sent its army. It had sent 41. Cale looked at the 3 sentences on the page in front of the council. Somewhere on that quiet blue planet there were billions more. He did not say this out loud. He did not need to. The 3 council members sitting across from him had read the same document, and from the way they were looking at it, they were thinking the same thing. The Empire still stood. The humans had chosen that. They had looked at everything they had access to, everything they had built over 8 months inside the bones of the most powerful military structure in the sector, and they had decided to leave it standing as a reminder rather than take it apart entirely. That was not mercy exactly. Cale had spent a long time thinking about what it was. It was a demonstration. A careful, precise, exhaustively documented demonstration of what 41 people from one planet could do when they decided to respond, not react, respond, to something that had been done to them. The message was not in the 3 sentences on the page. The message was everything that had happened in the 8 months before the page arrived. We could have. We chose not to. Remember that. Cale picked up his report and straightened the pages and set it back down. Outside, through the chamber window, the capital city was going about its day. Clean streets, functioning systems, ordinary life continuing the way it always had. Functioning, he now knew, on parameters that someone else had set. He wondered if they would ever fully change that. He suspected that was also a choice the humans had already thought about and decided to leave open. Just in case.